See people are joining. Welcome. Hello. Hello, everyone. Keep coming in. Hello, Abby, Jackie. Elise, hello. Thank you very much for joining. Hello, Abby from London. Thank you for joining. Okay, just give a few more seconds and then I'll start. Hello, Patricia. Helen from Liverpool. Amanda from Belfast. Hello. Thank you all so much. It's a very sunny evening, as you can probably tell by my screen, in London, and I think elsewhere. So I'm really, really glad and really appreciate the fact that everyone's been able to join this evening. Terry from Swansea, hello. Okay, just let just a couple more people join, a few more people join, and then we can start. Okay, so we'll just start, and then I think people will just join. So for Maria from Suffolk, hello. I hope it's sunny in Suffolk as well. So yeah, no, I'll start now, and then people will just join as we speak. So I am Basola Evans, Deputy Chair of Women in Journalism, and I just want to thank you all for being here this evening. I'm very, very excited about this discussion with the incredibly inspiring Laura Bates. I've admired, personally, I've admired her for years, and just very pleased that she can join us. So I'll just introduce her to you. I mean, Laura is an author, activist, speaker and founder of the Everyday Sexism Project, which she set up in 2012. The project is more than 200,000 testimonies of gender inequality. And this is now expanded to more than 20 countries worldwide. Laura has since written 7 books, and her latest, Fix the System, Not the Women, has just gone into paperback. Since setting up the Everyday Sexism Project, she has faced death threats, rape threats, has been forced to move house, and has had police installed panic alarms. But this has not stopped her from speaking about its really important issues affecting women and girls in modern society. As the inaugural winner of Women in Journalism's Georgina Henry Award, Laura has a particular interest in the media and the portrayal of women, which is a large part of what we're going to discuss today. So thank you, Laura, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm such a big fan of women in journalism, so this is really special for me. Thank you.
Oh, you know, you're very welcome. So, but most people here will be very aware of the Everyday Sexism Project, but just in case, you know, sort of anyone isn't, can you just briefly describe what it is and how it came about?
Yes, it's very simple. It's a website where people can share testimonies of any form of gender inequality. It could be anything from street harassment to workplace discrimination to sexual abuse. It can be shared by anybody, somebody of any gender in any country around the world. And we try to use the stories primarily to raise awareness, to force people to recognize the reality of gender inequality and how much it still impacts people's lives every day, to provide a cathartic, safe space and a sense of community and collective voice for survivors to feel that they're not alone, that it's not their fault, and also to campaign and lobby. So, for example, we've used the stories that came from young women to lobby ministers and education secretaries to change the curriculum so that sexual consent was included. We've used the stories from women on buses and trains to work with the British Transport Police to really reform the way that they deal with sexual violence and so on.
Yeah, it's been incredibly powerful. I mean, as I mentioned, you started the project in 2012, and then that came this sort of global conversation about, you know, how sexism is entrenched in our society, and just all the sort of daily displays of inequality. So how do you think the conversation has moved on over the past decade?
I think it's complicated. I think that what we've seen in the last decade is a evolution of the kind of feminist consciousness raising circles of the 1970s. We've seen it through projects like Everyday Sexism, but also through the kind of social media iteration of Me Too. We've seen it through Everyone's Invited. And I think that there's a huge amount of positive. I think the conversation has evolved into the mainstream, and that's a really important thing, that we couldn't move forward until this conversation was everywhere. We couldn't move forward until we were forcing people who didn't have to otherwise engage with this topic to recognize it and to acknowledge that it is a big issue. I think that societally we are reckoning with it and wrestling with it on a much more significant scale now than we were 10 years ago, and those are all really good things. I think that awareness has had such positives in terms of, for example, hundreds of new feminist societies springing up in schools across the country. When I go into schools now, young people are so much more politicized and active and aware of their rights, and they're fighting back, and all of those things give me great hope, and I think those are all great signs of progress. Having said that, I think that on the systemic level, we're not necessarily making the progress we should be in response to that outcry. I think that the movement and the collective voice and the hundreds of thousands of survivors who've so bravely shared their stories have moved us on brilliantly in terms of awareness. But we now need to look to gatekeepers, to people in positions of institutional power, to act in response to that awareness, to take action, to change things. And that's where I think we're still lagging behind.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think what we're seeing is a very worrying backlash. I think we're seeing a really worrying rise in online misinformation and conspiracy theories, particularly targeted at teenage boys, aided and abetted by the kind of use of algorithms as radicalization machines, but also more widely in the general public and facilitated by the mainstream media. And I think
not something you had, that was on the landscape, sort of 10, 11 years ago when you started the project.
Not to the same degree in terms of the online radicalization, but certainly I would say in terms of the mainstream media and its portrayal of all of this, it's been apparent from the very beginning that was always going to be an uphill struggle.
So do you feel that even in 2023, there's too much focus on what women need to do to sort of overcome the issues, which are essentially failures in society?
Massively. And I think that's deliberate, because if we focus on the women, if we blame the women, if we are constantly picking apart victims, only talking about kind of perfect survivors and victims, and sort of claiming that we can teach women to just be a bit more careful and the problem will go away, all of that focus, that relentless focus on women's behavior and dress and drinking and so on, prevents us from a collective outcry about the institutional failings in our society that are very real and that are the real source of the problem. And really, that's why I wrote this book. You see it so clearly in the last year or so alone. We've seen it in the response to what happened to Sarah Everard, the fact that a police and crime commissioner publicly said, well, she just shouldn't have submitted to the arrest that Wayne Couzens used, the false arrest, and women need to be more streetwise about when they can and can't be arrested. And we had the Met Police coming out saying that Wayne Couzens was a bad apple, no one could have seen him coming. We had them telling women in Clapham, don't go out on your own at night. Sabina Nessa was murdered, and they handed out hundreds of attack alarms to women in her local area. We saw Bobby Ann McLeod was murdered, and the leader of her city council came out and said that women shouldn't be putting themselves in compromising positions. And even in our public grief, we still focus on that idea of the behavior of victims. So the thing that trended around the world after Sarah's murder was she was just walking home and she did all the right things. And then Aisling Murphy was murdered, and the thing that trended everywhere was she was just going for a run. And I know it's not intended maliciously, but really that is as if to say these cases are tragic because these women weren't asking for it. And that's what makes it a tragedy, instead of one woman's being murdered every 3 days. And that's a systemic, desperate public health crisis. We don't recognize those institutional failings in policing, in criminal justice, in the media, in education. Instead, we continue to treat these as isolated incidents, and it really stops us from moving forwards.
Well, that's something that you really focus in your book, the fact that there's always this idea that these are isolated incidences, and there's a bad apple. We've heard that phrase "bad apple" used in lots of these cases. And do you think that's just a way of avoiding, sort of the real issues, essentially?
Absolutely. And, it's not a matter of difference of opinion. There is overwhelming evidence. Wayne Couzens was literally nicknamed the rapist by his colleagues, so widely known were his repugnant views. We know that in a 4-year period to 2020 alone, 2,000 serving police officers were reported for sexual misconduct. We know that the institutional processes for vetting and for responding to such allegations are utterly failing. Only 1 in 18 Met police officers accused of sexual assault ever faces any kind of formal action, for example. So they know, they are aware, they have these statistics, they are aware that this is a cultural issue, an institutional issue. We've seen report after report recently that has made that clear. It's used that language explicitly, institutional. And yet time and again, the response from people at the top of these institutions, even most recently, is to come out and say, oh, we don't really agree with the term institutional, and you just think, if we can't acknowledge the problem for what it is, it's very difficult to have any faith that it's going to be fixed in a meaningful way.
So in your book, you identified 5 ecosystems, essentially, where you sort of feel that institutional change needs to come. And that was education, policing, criminal justice, politics, and the media.
Yes.
So we'll certainly come to the media specifically, but why do you feel these 5 areas are particularly key in the battle against gender inequality?
Well, I think it's partly because they are, all of them, really integral at every stage to the kind of cyclical problem we have in our society. So it starts with the complete normalization of sexual violence within education settings, which starts us off on a cycle of normalization, on a cycle of victim blaming, on a cycle of not supporting and believing survivors. They then graduate into a world where there is a complete breakdown in terms of survivors coming forward to police. And I know, some people think that sounds hysterical, but if we look at the stark figures, fewer than 1.4% of rape cases reported to the police results in a charge or summons. So it's not hysterical to say that we live in a country where rape has essentially been decriminalized. We then turn to criminal justice expecting help, but the reality is that we know that it's an enormously male-dominated area. Men are being given kind of incredibly short sentences for murdering their wives. We've seen judges saying things like, oh, she was predatory and egged you on, when talking about child abuse cases. And so if we need that to be fixed, if we want systemic fixes in our society, we need to turn to politics. Politicians have the power to change things. But there is systemic institutional misogyny within a political system where 56 of our serving MPs are themselves currently under investigation for sexual misconduct. I mean, that's a 9% of our MPs. That isn't a system that can be relied upon to tackle this problem impartially. Only a third of our MPs are women. We have men watching porn in Parliament. And if we want to force politicians to take action, what do? We turn to the media to put pressure on them. But the media is absolutely colluding at the moment in that political misogyny when it runs double-page spreads accusing a senior female politician, for example, of crossing and uncrossing her legs to distract the Prime Minister. And within the media as well, we're seeing men who've murdered their wives described as henpecked or, soft and gentle. We're seeing questions raised in the media, is Me Too a witch hunt? Has feminism gone too far? Most recently, if we look at the tragic case of the murder of the head teacher of Epsom College, was she murdered because it was so hard for her husband to live in her shadow? So the reason I think those 5 systems matter is because we can't fix the problem in any one of those areas without tackling all the others, because they have such a tight circular knock-on effect on each other.
Mm. So let's touch on education, and we've touched on it a little bit now. I mean, there were some figures that sort of just really shocked me. I didn't realise, how just how awful it was. I mean, you said almost a third of 16 to 18-year-old girls experience unwanted sexual touching in school in the UK, and it's sort of one rape per day, sort of every school term is reported from UK schools. So do you essentially feel that schools are failing girls in that respect? I mean, it's very difficult not to think that.
Yes, absolutely. But I also think schools are themselves in turn being failed by a political system that turns a blind eye, a society that seems to be prepared to accept this as simply collateral damage rather than a public health crisis, and a government that has repeatedly failed to take this seriously, to give schools the resources, the training and the support that they need to deal with it appropriately. You know, it should be a source of national shame, a national crisis, that almost a third of our girls are sexually assaulted in school, in the place they go to learn. You know, there shouldn't be anything more important than that in our list of priorities. And yet it was reported very close, actually, these statistics and this kind of outcry came about around the same time that the Super League was announced. And I think that both the media and political response tells us a huge amount of the story there, because the Super League was positioned as this crisis that kind of threatened the very fabric of our nation. You know, you had royals on the cover of the papers saying, you know, this is a devastating blow to our national identity, and you had the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson saying, I'll clear the decks, I'm meeting with lawyers, I will stop this, I promise. And you know, within a week it was done. This kind of presumably multi-billion pound organization had been disbanded essentially. And you just think, imagine if that same degree of political will, of national outcry, of media focus could be placed on this enormous and devastating revelation of school sexual violence that had occurred only a few weeks earlier. You know, what kind of improvements we might be able to make.
Yeah. I mean, how young, do you feel over the last 10, 11 years that situation in schools has got worse?
Yes, I think, you know, of course, childhood sexual abuse and sexual violence amongst young people has sadly always existed. There is, of course, a part of this that's accounted for by young people feeling more able to come forward and to speak up through initiatives like Everyone's Invited, which are so brave and important. But there is another really vital element, which is online radicalization and the availability of online pornography. There's a really good Children's Commissioner report that's just come out, found that the average age that kids first see online porn is now 13, and a quarter of young people have seen it before the age of 12, which is a very significant proportion of young people to be younger than 12. But it's also about the nature of what they're seeing online. So we know that the online porn being served up to the kind of first-time users of the most easily accessible mainstream porn websites, 1 in 8 of those videos shows abusive, rape, coercive control, or otherwise illegal content. So it's really common now for me to go into schools. I work really regularly with young people, and to hear kids of 12 or 13 saying rape is a compliment, really, it's not rape if she enjoys it. I was in a school where they'd had a rape case involving a 14-year-old boy, and a teacher had said to him, why didn't you stop when she was crying? And he'd said, because it's normal for girls to cry during sex, because that's what he'd seen online. So that's what you're up against now. And we are also up against a situation where social media platforms, immensely powerful algorithms, are being used to radicalize a generation of boys into extremist, misogynistic content under the radar, to the degree that TikTok pumped out videos of Andrew Tate until they'd been viewed 11.3 billion times, you know, more views than the number of people on the planet. So it's no surprise that we're now in a situation where more boys, in a recent survey, said they knew who Andrew Tate was than who the Prime Minister is, Rishi Sunak. And that is a different scale. So yes, this has always existed, but it's now on steroids.
Yeah. Do you, how young do you feel that's, or do you think that misogyny begins? You know, is that something, right?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things I write about in Fix the System, Not the Women, is that every woman I know has a list, a trailing list of experiences from our earliest childhood that come to define and impact us. And my first experience when I wrote down my list was when my parents went in the car to introduce my baby brother to my grandparents for the first time. And when we left, there was a piece of gold jewelry on the seat of the car. And my mum said to my dad, "Oh, where's this come from? What's this for?" And he said, "Oh, it's because you finally had a boy," because I was an older sister and I have another sister. You know, it is right from the beginning. It's the baby grows that say future nuclear scientist and future superhero in the boys section, and I hate my thighs, or pretty as a princess, or smile in the girls section. And gradually over time, you know, from the bombardment of children's clothing to toys and books, the messages are perpetuated. We know that girls are 5 when they first start to worry about the size and shape of their bodies. We know that a quarter of 7-year-old girls have dieted to lose weight, and by the time they reach the age of 10, that number goes up to 80%. So it really isn't exaggerating to say that it starts at the very beginning, I think.
So do you think that part of the solution to that aspect, at least, would be to just, you know, sort of start creating those building blocks around, you know, sort of consent and, you know, healthy boundaries, you know, while they're, you know, sort of really young? Is that, you know, what is the solution, and what are some of the solutions for that?
Yes, and again, I think this is a good example, I think, again, of where the media comes into play, because of the very negative media backlash to calls for better sex education earlier. And we've seen this recently in the kind of alarmist coverage of relationships and sex education reforms. There is this sense of panic that when you talk about starting young, people go, "Oh, you can't talk to 3-year-olds about, you know, porn or about sex." But if you teach a 3-year-old at nursery, "We don't hit other children," nobody goes, "Oh, you can't talk to them about violence." So of course we accept there are age appropriate, simple ways to deal with serious issues. And in this case, it's about teaching from birth, this is your body and you get to make choices about your body, and we respect other people's choices about their own bodies. And of course, that doesn't look like having a conversation about porn with a 3-year-old. What it looks like is saying, when you know, say goodbye to uncle or grandpa, how would you like to say goodbye today? Are you going to do a high five? Are you going to do a wave? Or are you going to give grandpa a hug? Instead of saying, "Go and hug grandpa, go and hug grandpa." There are ways to build this in a very gentle, age-appropriate way, and it's vital that we start doing that, because at the moment it's too little too late.
And how big a responsibility do you think the media has when it comes to sort of framing the narrative around sexism?
Absolutely immense. And the frustrating thing is that the media has an incredible opportunity, I think, to play a really powerful, positive role, because of course it is a source of power. You know, it's not just about informing us what's going on in the world, it's about shaping our national response to it, you know, to the degree of even kind of swinging elections in the most extreme examples. And I think there are so many ways that the media comes into play with this. You know, it's everything from that betrayal of body image, the portrayal of female celebrities, the objectification of women's bodies, the critique of, you know, pregnancy and so on, to the kind of really, I think, extension of misogyny, whether it's in the kind of portrayal of female politicians, or whether it's putting a woman who dares to complain about sexism on front of one of our biggest selling newspapers with feminazi in block letters above her head. But it's also that portrayal of attempts at progress that's so damaging, because you've got, you know, media outlets continually ringing up saying, "Will you come on to discuss whether Kleenex man-sized tissues are sexist? Will you come on? Are you really offended by men working overhead signs?" These are real examples. We're having a TB debate, man flu, fact or fiction? Has feminism gone too far? You know, all of these so-called debates, which are just about stirring up clickbait and controversy, portraying feminists as whinging, whining, overreacting women, making a fuss about nothing. And it's very deliberate. And it's not to say that this is a kind of unilateral picture, because there are brilliant media outlets I know working so hard, and individual journalists doing brilliant work. You know, the fact that it was that investigation that sparked the Me Too movement, for example, and held Harvey Weinstein to account, is a brilliant example of that. But more widely, and particularly where there is immense power in journalism, you can see again the impact that that has. And again, we can trace it back to a power imbalance within the institution. We know that women, because of women in journalism, we know that women only write a quarter of front page newspaper articles. Because of women in journalism, we know that almost 90% of those front pages are about a man, a male subject or expert. Because of women in journalism, we know that around 20% of women who are working in journalism have experienced abuse so bad that it's made them consider leaving the profession. And so it does matter. It's a really direct impact. And there's another study that shows that the greater the degree of sexism in the media, the lower the proportion of female candidates for political office. Yeah. So it really does have an impact, and it really matters.
So do you think that it seems to me that there can often be just this narrative that the whole idea of progression is, sort of the movement is anti-men, and it's, the whole thing is a bad thing because it's creating a gender war. Mm-hmm. Do you see that as well?
No, yeah, I mean, I see that narrative, but again, I feel that is very much a media concocted narrative. To the degree that I went on a very high-profile television program to talk about these issues, and they chose to call the title of the program the war on men, or gender wars, or something like that, men versus women. And it is a media invention, because the reality is that every woman I know who is working on the front lines of these issues, every feminist I know, every frontline, feminist organization, they are trying to dismantle structures and expectations and stereotypes that are suffocating and damaging people of all genders. And if you look at these issues that people hold up when they try to polarize us and suggest that this is a battle of the sexes, they will invariably hold up specific issues affecting men as if to say, how can you bang on about women and those issues when, for example, the male suicide rate is 3 times higher than it is for women? And the implication there is that you've got to pick a team. And if you care about that issue of male suicide, you can't pretend to care about women, because these feminists just want to sweep these uncomfortable truths under the carpet. But the opposite of that is true, because if we look into the facts behind that tragically high male suicide rate, what we can see is that it's happening because men are dramatically less likely than women to reach out for support when they experience mental health crisis. And we have very good research to suggest why that's happening too. It's happening because we bring up children in a world where we teach them boys don't cry. So if we care about dismantling the structures that are literally killing and suffocating men, we are talking about dismantling patriarchal gender stereotypes. It's part of the same fight. We really very much are on the same side. And I think we have to really look at who it suits to continue to propagate this narrative that it's actually a gender war and a battle of the sexes.
And I mean, as you've said, it's about dismantling, sort of this whole institution and sort of the systemic behavior. How does one even start to do that? How do we challenge it? How do we start to make a difference? It seems so entrenched. All the examples that you've given, it's almost sort of, it's even exhausting to think about in terms of trying to even dismantle.
Yeah, it is. It is overwhelming, and I do appreciate that. I mean, I think the first step is acknowledgement and holding gatekeepers and people in positions of power accountable for that acknowledgement. The second step is structural and systemic reform, root and branch reform. So a good example would be to reform the House of Lords, where at the moment we have, bishops sitting making choices that impact everyone in the country, when until very recently women couldn't even become bishops. We've got peers, hereditary peers, where the peerages can't pass to a girl. There is literally inbuilt institutional misogyny fundamental to that structure. There are structural but easy fix decisions that we could make tomorrow if we wanted to. For example, elevating domestic abuse to be a national priority in policing in the same way as terrorism. It affects 1.6 million women every year. So the reality is that it is impacting many more people in this country. There are police forces around the country. Not every police force has a specialist rape and sexual offences unit. There are specific issues, diverting funding to schools to support teachers in better, really high quality training around relationships and sex education. There are a huge number of things we could do that are actually kind of no-brainers. So the fact that we are not shows a lack of political will. And holding social media companies and platforms to account for the damage that they're doing with the radicalization of young people is another really good example of that, I think.
Yeah. Do you find that you have a lot of women on board? You know, do you have, is there a problem with, you know, sort of, you know, not having certain women who are not, you know, who actually don't believe in the, you know, in the cause that we're fighting for, and think, you know, and really sort of play into that sort of idea that, you know, sort of there's a gender war and we're going, you know, and certain things are over the top. I mean, sort of one example of that that's been raised a few times is the sort of the Jeremy Clarkson piece that he wrote about sort of Meghan Markle. And and the fact that it was a female that published it, you know, sort of that put the sort of, you know, sort of allowed it to go ahead, albeit seen by sort of, you know, sort of lots of men as well.
I mean, I think inevitably, of course, those women will exist. We live in a deeply patriarchal society in which there is a huge benefit to women of going along with those kind of patriarchal norms. We know that it's a coping mechanism, right? It's a kind of defense strategy to be, you know, not one of those girls, you know, to be one of the guys, to make sexist jokes. And you're richly rewarded for that, particularly if you're somebody who is embedded within a deeply misogynistic institution. But in my experience, those women are relatively few and far between. There is a huge groundswell of support. And in my experience, as Gloria Steinem once said, women don't have the power to be their own worst enemies. Generally speaking, if we keep our eye on where the power is, of course, there are women who are part of the problem, part of the system, but in my experience, they are not the fundamentally the kind of major drive of the problem.
Yeah. You've talked quite extensively about the online abuse that you've received over the years. Is that something that you're still having to deal with on a daily basis?
Yeah, on a bad day, I can get 200 rape threats and death threats in a single day, and they are extensive and detailed, and they will target your family and your whereabouts and events, and it is something that is kind of life-changing. And I think it's important that we acknowledge it. I think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, almost every woman I know in the public eye experiences it to varying degrees. It's important to acknowledge that my colleagues who are women of colour, who are working class women, disabled women, trans women, experience it to a greater degree than I do, and also experience less support, particularly within the media afterwards and from social media platforms. And it's very debilitating. You know, I think that recent Women in Journalism report about the extent of the abuse faced by over half of women journalists and the degree to which so many of them are considering quitting their career as a result. It's a really stark warning about the very high societal cost if we choose to turn a blind eye to online abuse. Too often, I think people treat it as if it's just, you know, disagreement, it's just people not being thick-skinned enough, not being able to cope with it. It isn't that. It's a form of ongoing psychological trauma. And I know it has a massive impact. Sorry?
Yeah, sorry, I was about to ask, sorry, that, you know, so do you think as a society we are getting a bit desensitized to it, and it's almost now something that women are expected to just navigate and just to sort of, you know, sort of just get through it without anything actually being done about it because it's so normalized?
Definitely, because it's now so widespread and it's happening with total impunity. So people are kind of bored of hearing about it. And I think there's a fundamental lack of understanding of what we really mean when we talk about it. You know, people think if they haven't experienced what it's like to have thousands of people sending you directly their fantasies of how they would disembowel you, which weapons they would use to give you internal sexualized injuries and how they'd use them, telling you that they've found your location and that they're outside waiting for you. It's really difficult to explain. And we have a really kind of high tolerance for violence against women. You know, it's funny, we're much more sympathetic to someone who says, oh, I was watching an alien movie last night and then I woke up in the middle of the night and heard a noise and I completely panicked, than we are to a woman saying, you know, I read 200 death threats yesterday and now I'm too scared to go out of the house on my own. People go, oh, for goodness sake, they're just trying to scare you. You know, they don't mean it. You're not in any real danger. Get over it. Turn off the computer. It's not taken seriously enough, and it's not penalized because social media companies aren't held accountable.
Yeah. You touched on Andrew Tate sort of, you know, sort of a bit earlier, and you know, so there's still a sort of, you know, a media concentration / obsession over him. Why do you think that is? I mean, do you think that it's because there's an, you know, sort of the media would rather like to think that it's an isolated thing and he's so, you know, against the norm, and that's why he should be focused on? Why do you think there is this obsession with him?
Well, I think it's partly because he's good for ratings. He's shocking and titillating, and he's been presented in that way. He has been presented as controversial. He's been presented as an icon. He's been presented as an influencer, when the reality is that he's an extremist who is openly advocating violence against women, and who has been, obviously, is currently in detention on allegations of sexual violence. But I think what we're seeing is the conflation of two different societal blind spots. So it's a kind of Venn diagram. The first one is a racist blind spot, where our society finds it incredibly difficult to recognize that a white man can be an extremist or a terrorist. So we just don't see him in that way. We would not be providing the same kind of platform to a different form of extremist and kind of debating his views as if they're totally valid and just a bit kind of out there. And then the other one is a misogynistic blind spot, where we find it really difficult to recognize extremist misogyny for what it is. We don't see violence against women as a form of extremism because it is so normal. We are so used to it. And as a result, he's been catapulted to international fame by the mainstream media. It's not just social media, it's the spotlight and the platform that the mainstream media put on him and continues to give him that is fueling his success, both financially and culturally.
I suppose many publications would argue that in order to sort of stop his behaviour or curtail his behaviour, they have to shine a light on it. Do you think it would just be better not to, you know, cover him at all? Or how would, you know, what would be the best way of dealing with that situation?
I mean, I completely understand that where there is kind of newsworthy, you know, where there's a court case and the result of that court case needs to be reported on, but that's a completely different thing from making kind of, you know, origin story documentaries about him. And I think what I would argue is the media treating him in the same way as they would treat people openly advocating other forms of extremism? And if not, then there is something going on there.
Yeah. So how do we, I mean, we've talked a bit about how we could start to reform these institutions, but I think one of the main things that needs to be considered is if there's a real appetite for change. Because you need that appetite in order to, you know, sort of create that change. Do you think there is that appetite for change, particularly as we've now we recognise that, you know, sort of, you know, a lot of these institutions which we want change are sort of male dominated?
I think there is appetite for change, and I think that particularly amongst young women, there's an impatient appetite for change, which gives me hope. But I also think that we can't underestimate the scale of the backlash. And one of the things that people like to say is, these are old-fashioned attitudes and they will die out, and things incrementally get better over time, and they're always moving in a more positive direction. And the same will be true if we're patient for long enough. And I think what's really scary, but what we have to recognize, is that for the first time in history, the extremity of young men's views about women, about sexual violence, is outstripping that of older generations. So if you look at the British Attitude Survey and you ask people in the UK, do you think a woman's to blame for being raped if she was flirting or if she'd been drinking beforehand? Then amongst the general population, a horrifying kind of between a quarter and a third say yes. But amongst the youngest cohort surveyed, 18 to 24, that goes up significantly. And that Children's Commissioner report I mentioned on online pornography it found that 79% of 18 to 21-year-olds said that they'd seen porn involving sexual violence before the age of 18. So this is a generation who are growing up with such extreme misogyny presented to them. And if we don't recognize that, and if we just kind of assume things will get better, the younger generation are all woke and, you know, they totally just want everything to get better and it'll be fine if we don't do anything, we're in real trouble. So we do have to keep taking action.
And you mentioned sort of that between sort of the ages of 18 to 24 young men, when you go into schools, are you seeing that reflected in those even younger?
Yes, absolutely. From a really, really young age, these views are apparent. And it's a mixed picture, you know, this is not about kind of vilifying young men and boys. There are, I would say, increasing numbers of boys who are really aware of these issues and wanting to help and be part of the change. But I would say that in most schools I go into, there is a kind of small but significant minority of boys who have clearly experienced some form of online radicalization. And you can see that because they come out with the kind of misinformation that is circulating on social media. Women are lying about rape all the time. Good men are losing their jobs because of positive action. Me Too is a witch hunt. Men are the real oppressed minorities of today's society. The gender pay gap is a myth. Feminism is all about women taking over the world. These are very common views now amongst boys, and that's really heartbreaking for them as well. Because the reality is that, you know, a man in the UK is 230 times more likely to be raped himself than falsely accused of rape. So if we cared about boys and supporting them, we'd be talking about male survivors of sexual violence, not kind of, you know, bombarding them all with misinformation and conspiracy theories about false rape allegations, which have been disproven again and again.
I mean, your work, your sort of magnificent work, has sort of given so many women sort of the strength to fight back and tell their stories, and made men as well sort of much more aware of their actions and behaviour. Do you feel hopeful that there will be significant change? I mean, you know, with you know, you launched the project 11 years ago now. What do you hope to see the next decade?
I feel hopeful but wary. I think that there are threats that we are not recognizing that are flying under the radar. I think that online radicalization is one of them. I think another one is the kind of inherent misogyny and racism that is built into AI and the metaverse and other technological advancements that at the moment people kind of see as sort of far off you know, things of films, but the reality is that they are going to have a big impact on our lives, and they are being engineered and created by a workforce that is predominantly affluent white men. And we've seen before what the kind of built-in limitations are when that's the case, and those blind spots are present. But I think if we're not thinking about it now, it's going to be too late. So I think there are a lot of risks inherently kind of coming down the track. But I also feel really hopeful that this is a time of great political energy behind feminism. There are so many people who are fighting so hard on so many fronts. And of course, the internet has also allowed us to amplify each other's voices, to support the struggles of women in different countries, for example. So there are a lot of positives as well. And the young women who are growing up in a feminist world and finding feminism and fighting back give me great hope. So I don't know, it's difficult to predict what we're going to see, but I'm hopeful.
Well, I think that's a lovely note to end on. I think hope is, I suppose, what we need in this situation. Yeah. But thank you so much. What we're going to do now is to sort of answer some questions. You know, so if you have any questions for Laura, please sort of type it in the chat box. There's one here from Maria Pitraku. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. She says, how can we get involved to help with all the issues you mentioned? I find myself so often wanting to help, but I'm not sure which organisations to reach out to help.
That's a great question, thank you. I think what's really great is that there are a lot of fantastic feminist organisations who are working on brilliant campaigns, and they are looking for support in terms of needing people to kind of email their MPs to sign petitions. Some I would suggest following on social media so you can see when things are coming up and when they need support are Women for Refugee Women, Rights of Women, the Centre for Women's Justice, Level Up, Pregnant and Screwed, and the End Violence Against Women Coalition. And there are so many opportunities. I mean, at the moment, just within those groups alone, you've got petitions around reforming the childcare sector, petitions around ending the detention of refugee women, petitions about having a high-profile investigation into institutional misogyny and policing. So right there, and one Level Up is campaigning specifically on the issue of the media reporting around male violence against women. So right there, you've already got a whole load of things you can do, ways to get involved and support.
Brilliant, thank you. This question is from Patricia Ball. How can we call out better quality, she says in inverted quotes, how can we call out better quality newspapers for their choice of images of women?
It's very frustrating, I think. There is sometimes an assumption that this is a problem that solely rests with certain specific elements of the media, and it really isn't. It's true to say that this is kind of often across the board. I think that making sure that we speak out against it, that there is a kind of collective outcry, that we are writing to editors when this is happening, that we're making it clear that readers care. I think it's also important to support organisations like Women in Journalism, who are working so hard to champion and support getting more diverse voices into those decision-making rooms in the first place, because that's another way to tackle it. And I think it's also about kind of needing that sort of institutional shift, because at the moment, in terms of press regulation, if we look at something like what complete lack of institutional action was taken after the Angela Rayner hit piece, or after that piece about Meghan Markle, you know, that one of our biggest national newspapers can platform a tirade suggesting that a woman of colour should be paraded down the street and naked and pelted with excrement, and there just isn't any form of comeback to it. There isn't any form of repercussions. It just makes it something that can be done with impunity. I mean, I think if we're looking at kind of media specific reform, it's very tricky, because of course you have to weigh it with freedom of speech, which is incredibly important. But if we look at the outcome of the Leveson inquiry and the complete lack of reform really that's come about as a result of that, I think you can see how difficult it is to affect real change in that space.
Well, thank you. And there's another question here from well, one of ours, Yasmin Alibaba Brown. She says, what do you do when these key institutions, so these institutions that we've talked about, are led by women, e.g. Cressida Dick, the female editor who printed Jeremy Clarkson's violent fantasy about Meghan Markle? So we sort of touched on that, really.
Yeah. I think we have to hold them accountable in exactly the same way as we would male gatekeepers. I think it's a very good example of the fact that catapulting a few women into positions of power without changing the system doesn't fix things. I think that the fact that Cressida Dick was eventually held accountable for her repeated refusal to acknowledge the institutional elements of the problem was a moment of real hope for me, but it hasn't so far kind of yielded any particularly great results or changes. I think it's very difficult because, of course, we want to support other women, and particularly women who have made their way into high-profile positions. But I think we also need to remember not to focus on just those women who are in incredibly privileged positions, but also to recognise how this is impacting women who are in low-paid jobs, on unstable or zero-hours contracts, women who don't have an HR department to complain to, you know, women who risk losing their jobs if they come forward, women whose abusers are using their immigration status as a weapon against them. You know, I think it's those women I think of when people say, oh, but, you know, we can't attack this one incredibly privileged, high-profile woman. Yes, we can, if she is standing in the way of enormous systemic progress that's impacting thousands of other women.
Thank you. And there's another question here, again from Patricia, actually. So is there anything similar to your work in America or other countries that we can join?
Yes, absolutely. The Women's Media Centre in America, particularly around the issues we've been discussing on media. They also have a branch called the Speech Project, which is all about online abuse. There's also a brilliant charity called Glitch, which is UK based but has an international reach. And they particularly look at online abuse, and particularly on online abuse faced by women of colour. And they also work with women who are thinking about careers in politics to give them support and training. So that's another great charity to support.
Thank you. Louise Court says, do you ever feel like it's all too tough in the face of, you know, the abuse you get to keep going?
Yeah, of course. I think anybody would. I think that a lot of the stuff, the kind of glib, you know, self-care stuff doesn't really cut it, because, you know, there is no bubble bath or scented candle that is strong enough to deal with this stuff. But I'm also, you know, partly stubborn and don't want to let them win, because giving up based on abuse lets them know that that tactic works. But also, I'm, you know, really aware of how incredibly privileged I am. Yes, it's a difficult situation to be in, but it is nothing compared to what women in Iran are risking right now, you know, fighting for their rights. It's nothing compared to the mind-blowing level of abuse that someone like Diane Abbott faces. And I feel partly that I have a real responsibility towards the hundreds of thousands of women who've shared their stories with me. You know, their courage is incredible, and I want to do them justice. And I want to send a message to the girls I meet in schools, you know, who are receiving this kind of stuff online as well, who are being bombarded with, you know, explicit images from men they don't know and online abuse, to show them, you know, if I give up, if I'm terrified into silence, then where does it leave them? You know, I hope that we will change it. I don't want to say, like, you know, I'll just fight against it and it's possible to keep battling on, because I don't think that that's sustainable. I don't want that to be the price that every woman has to pay to choose to speak out. But I hope that we will keep fighting to change things so that actually there isn't impunity for this kind of behaviour forever, and things will shift.
Yeah. Thank you. So a couple more questions, if that's if that's okay.
Of course, yeah.
So Abby Amoaku says, maybe this is a hard question, but how can we support women in the spotlight while also holding them accountable? And she's thinking of the celebrity feminists who attended the Met Gala for Karl Lagerfeld, who's, you know, a famous misogynist. Yeah. That, she said, that comes to mind.
Yeah,
that was a tricky one that made many people feel rather uncomfortable.
Yeah, it is it's a good question, and you're right, it is a hard question. I mean, I think it's okay to want to talk about those issues. I don't think that it has to be a kind of get out of jail free card that we just never critique women because they're women. Of course, you know, it's okay to have robust debate and to hold those women accountable, as long as we're also holding men accountable as well. You know, I think we need to keep things in proportion. And I think that we should recognise that we are often quicker to tear apart women for perceived hypocrisy than we are to tackle, you know, for women who are not necessarily perfect at every second, but who are trying, then sometimes giving kind of a free pass to high profile men who are actively creating deliberate and aware harm on a day-to-day basis. So that proportionality is important. I think that we can discuss someone's choices, disagree with someone, have a robust debate with someone without necessarily kind of calling for their work to be kind of cancelled and that kind of thing. And most importantly, I think we remember what Gloria Steinem said, keep your eye on where the power is. What are the systemic critiques? Who are the gatekeepers we can be focusing on? Because for me, just from a purely pragmatic perspective, that is the quickest route to really structural change.
Yeah, thank you. Caroline, what's sick? Please, I hope I've got that right, or I haven't butchered it too much. She asked, what materials would you recommend in order to get more knowledge about feminism? Any documentaries, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, so many. That's a great question. I would recommend books, books like We Should All Be Feminists, Invisible Women, anything by Bell Hooks. I would recommend following organisations like the End Violence Against Women Coalition on social media. I think you could, if you want something to watch, there's a fantastic drama called Unbelievable on Netflix, which is not a documentary but a drama, but it is based on a true story, and it really kind of shows the reality of how the justice system fails survivors of sexual violence. Hopefully those are good starting places. Yeah.
And someone's added here, any book by Laura Bates.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind.
I think let's see if we've got any more questions. Just check here. Right, I've got sorry, I've just got a couple more questions.
Sure.
This is anonymous, which said, as you said, the media plays a crucial role. Any thoughts on how women in journalism who are not yet in senior positions can further this fight and their feminist principles through their journalism?
That is a great question, and a very generous question for somebody in that position. I think the first thing that's important to say is that you are not solely responsible for bringing down this system on your own. You have to fight as hard as you can, but you also sometimes will need to protect yourself and your mental health, and that's okay. You don't have to fight every battle. You don't have to feel solely responsible. If you're working within a situation that is institutionally misogynistic and racist, as the media is, as policing is, then it is very difficult, I think, and very draining. And the fact that you are there at all and that you care is, a step forward in the right direction. I think what I would recommend is that there are really good media guidelines that have been created by organisations like Refuge and Women's Aid. Circulating those amongst colleagues is a really good way to kind of do something proactive, even as a fairly junior employee. I think that standing together with and supporting other women is another good way forward, because it hopefully avoids some of that risk of being kind of scapegoated or seen as a feminazi or kind of ostracised. And I think just keep going, because eventually you will be in a position to change things, hopefully, and we're all very grateful for that.
Thank you. And then this may be our last question here, but it's quite a sort of a serious one. So Jackie Cottrell said says, I have a friend whose 12-year-old daughter received a sexually explicit message from a man on a social media app. How do we challenge this? What's the way to raise this so they don't get away with it, especially as the apps don't seem to do much to prevent it?
Yeah, I mean, it is absolutely horrendous. It's incredibly common, devastatingly common. And you're absolutely right that, again, there is this problem of impunity, because social media companies just focus on their profits and their bottom line. And if they banned all the abusive users, it would hit them financially. So I think that the only option to really force them as consumers to take it seriously is to try and hit them financially. So I think it is, as consumers, we need to stand together. We need to campaign as a collective voice. When we did a big campaign around rape and domestic violence content on Facebook, for example, it was the fact that 60,000 people joined the campaign, wrote letters to their MPs and so on, that forced social media companies to take action. So I think getting other people on side, creating campaigns, but also I think it is very much about who we vote in terms of who is going to be in positions of power to take action to force that impunity on, so to force that accountability rather on social media companies. So it's about government, it's about writing to your MP, and it's about who you choose to vote for in the next election, essentially, because the power to force social media companies to hold them accountable for that kind of abuse is with our politicians, and we should absolutely hold them accountable for that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. There's so many things to unpick there, and I'm just sort of really grateful, as I'm sure everyone is, that you have taken this time to speak to us, and it's just been really incredible to sort of hear your thoughts and everything. I just want to say a big thank you to Laura for joining us and for this talk, and thank you to everyone who joined, and I hope you've all found it really interesting and informative, and just something that we have a lot to sort of digest and think about. I understand this whole talk has been recorded, and you'll be able to access it afterwards. I think they'll sort of put something in the chat about that. So you can sort of look over it again and unpick it all. But thank you everyone, and thank you for joining us. Really like to talk.
Thank you so much, everyone, for having me. Thank you.
Have a good evening, everyone. Good night.